An Odd Boy, Volume 1 by Ngak'chang Rinpoche, Chapter 3, Part 2. My interest in the Norse world put me in the way of an extremely large book. It was almost unreadable, but I persevered with it. It was a psychological portrait of the Norse gods, and I had to look up words in the dictionary in almost every other sentence. I asked for help with it at school, but was told that it was not a book for someone of my age. I was pointed in the direction of adventure stories, but I ignored this and went back to the textbook. I discussed it with Steve, and he was quite interested. "You should keep a notebook to write down the words that you don't understand. Then you can look them up in a dictionary. That's what I do." I told him that was a brilliant idea and did so. The book was still hard to understand, but I wanted to know what these Norse gods were and where they were. It occurred to me that the fact that people didn't believe in them anymore made as much sense as their believing in God. Why believe one thing and disbelieve another, when there was no absolute evidence either way? I told Steve it's easier to believe in Norse gods than the God who created everything apart from himself. Steve thought that was a good point, and so I continued, "I mean, how can it make sense that the creator of everything is always there and not created by anything? Was there some bigger God who created that God? No, that would be ridiculous." "The question would go on forever," Steve agreed, "and there'd never be an answer to it." It reminded me of something my father had said. "Fleas have other fleas that prey on them, and they have fleas that bite them, and so proceeds ad infinitum." My father could be humorous at times, though his Latin was suspect. Steve said, "It seems to me that if God can be the uncreated creator, then everything else can also be created by itself, without need of a creator." I liked that idea. It made perfect sense. "Right," I replied. "If God can just happen, then everything can just happen. God was probably just a way of getting rid of the other gods and making some sort of superpower like mousy tongue." It was the learned Steve who finally told me the name was Mao Tse-tung. I felt pretty stupid about that mistake, but Steve laughed with me about it rather than at me. In fact, he started calling him Mousy Tongue as well, and it became a joke. I told my parents, and they thought it was very funny. Now they call him Mousy Tongue too. That was amazing to me. I never thought that parents could be whimsical or find children's ideas interesting. But then I remembered the Trevelyan's and realised it was my father who was the main impediment to free eccentricity. Steve's knowledge of music encouraged me to pay great attention in the music class. I knew I wouldn't receive private music lessons as he did. My parents couldn't afford it, and even if they could, my father would not have seen it as worthwhile. I learned the rudiments of music whilst at junior school. The music teacher, Mr. French, apart from being rather stiff in his opinions, was a good and enthusiastic teacher. I knew about brevs, semi-brev, minims, crotchets, quavers, semi-quavers, demi-semi-quavers, and hemi-demi-semi-quavers. It seemed like a fascinating and worthwhile form of arithmetic, and one that I could enjoy. It was exciting, and I wanted to know more. But no, I had to work out how many hours it would take 4 men to dig 5 holes, when 6 men could dig 7 holes in 8 weeks, and die of traffic fumes. This was crazy when you could be learning music theory. Men digging holes held no interest for me whatsoever. Who ever thought of such an idea? I wondered if I could have a guitar for Christmas, but my grandmother was not coming to Britain for Christmas, so there was no chance of that. Guitars led to loutish behaviour. Steve arranged, with his parents and mine, for me to come and stay at his house on occasional weekends. It turned out to be almost every weekend, or at least every other weekend, as my father seemed happy about the arrangement. Steve's father was a police superintendent, and my father approved of that. It was a good environment. I'd not be led into nudism by vegetarian cranks. These weekends were a marvellous opportunity to spend time with a friend, learn about music, practice guitar, and escape my father. Steve seemed well ahead of the school's music lessons, and so I was able to ask him questions about the musical structures we'd been taught. He'd show me the differences between the time signatures by using a stick on the school rubbish bin or whatever happened to be at hand. I told Steve about the music tree in the woods behind my home. There was a cave we would frequent on our weekend rambles, and it had some similar yew trees quite close. We improvised rhythms on those too. Steve liked to go exploring, and sometimes we would wander for miles around. He was interested in history and told me that there was interesting history locally, that you didn't have to go as far back or as far away as Norway to find interesting things. That's how we came to go to the cave. It was about half a mile from Moor Park Mansion, which was a residential facility and used by various institutions such as Farnham Art School. The cave was known as Mother Ludlam's Hole. Mother Ludlam was an amiable Rubenesque witch who lived there in the 1500s or thereabouts. Below the cave is a small stream which flows out of a hidden spring. The water's remarkably pure, good enough to drink, and we often did. There was a cluster of hills called the Devil's Jumps. There was a deep circular valley called the Devil's Punch Bowl near Hindhead, where you could walk for hours and never see another person if it was a weekday. Stony Jump is the highest of the Devil's Jumps, and you can see Frensham Pond from there. I thought these devil names were marvellous, and enjoyed seeing the Devil's Frying Pan in Cadgwith on the Lizard Peninsula, where we took our annual family holidays. The Devil had all the good songs and all the good places. Mother Ludlam's cauldron is kept at the small church in Frensham. There were all kinds of mysteries to explore when I was young, and I'd usually take my drawing book to draw anything that looked interesting. I must have had quite a pile of drawing books, but I have no idea what happened to them. We'd usually light a fire in Mother Ludlam's hole and feed scraps of copper wire into it. There seemed to be a limitless supply of copper wire available for reasons entirely obscure to me. The vivid blue-green in the flames was always entirely amazing, as if we had discovered some great mystery. There's probably a turnstile at Mother Ludlam's hole now, and attendants to make sure that no one does anything out of the ordinary. No one ever went there when I was a boy, as far as I can remember, so our fire was never called into question. A gypsy woman once wandered by and asked if she could sit by our fire. She said she was cold, and we told her she was welcome. She had a strange accent and wore colourful clothes. She asked us what we were doing in a kindly way, and we told her we were putting copper wire in the fire to see the colour of the flames change. She laughed, but said nothing further, just sat there warming her hands. We fell to talking by ourselves, and she left without a word. We just turned round, and she was gone. We never saw her go. We used to sing songs in that cave, and I taught Steve some blues numbers. Steve thought I had a good voice, and he liked listening to me sing. He thought that blues had wild lyrics, and so he started learning the words to them so that he could sing along with me. Nothing much happened before 1962 in the way of music in the charts, so we sang no pop songs. But in that year the Beatles appeared, and music finally started to go somewhere. It seemed somehow momentous that the Beatles released their first single, Love Me Do, on my birthday, the 6th of June. Then came the first album, Please Please Me, later that year. The Beatles were all we talked about. They had that sound. Although they sounded nothing like Big Bill Broonzy, they had a richness and depth I'd not heard before in the charts, and that was what it was all about. The Rolling Stones had also appeared in 1962, but didn't come to our attention until 1963, when they released a cover of Chuck Berry's number Come On, again on my birthday. Later that year, they released a cover of the Lennon and McCartney number, I Wanna Be Your Man. It seemed that Steve and I had the makings of a band. I could sing, and Steve had rhythm guitar covered, and would be getting onto bass soon. So we just needed a drummer and a lead guitarist, and we'd be set. Then all we would have to do was practice. I started wondering if you could mix the Beatles with blues. I liked the structure of blues, the repeated line, and the simple rhyming scheme. I started thinking that I should write song lyrics rather than poetry, and so I started looking at the blues lyrics I knew. I looked at the Beatles lyrics too. I wrote song lyrics and melodies with Steve on the weekends that I stayed at his house, which happened quite regularly through primary school and secondary school. Steve could read and write music, so he was able to collect our ideas for further exploration. There was usually a little musical input from me on our songs, but mainly because I couldn't resist coming up with crazy ideas, like ascending scales in minor chords and descending scales in major chords. I'd learnt about major and minor chords from Steve, as this kind of thing was not covered in school. Weekends with the Bruces were superb. I was happy to be elsewhere, away from my father's surveillance, and able to feel relaxed. My version of being relaxed, of course, was experienced as ultra-polite. I was therefore always welcome and seen as the best influence. It was extremely exciting to me to go to Steve's house because I got to see and hear his guitar. He showed me how to play some chords. I was astounded by the process. It was hard work and it hurt my fingers. I wasn't expecting that, but eventually I managed 6 chords. There was a problem, however. Unless I was at his house, I never had a chance to practice. I could sing, certainly, but I also wanted to play guitar. Still, it was a start. Steve had a brother called Mark, who was 3 or 4 years older. Mark played bass guitar. Now that was a serious thing. The first time I heard him play, I knew it was my kind of instrument. It was a slightly worn 1940s bass guitar that had been passed down to him by his Uncle Stan. I have no idea what it was. It may have been a Dan Electro, but I can't be certain. It could have been a Longhorn. Whatever it was, it sounded wonderfully ominous. It was as if you could drive a nail into a plank just by touching a string. So this was a bass guitar. It's impossible to explain the impact of that sound at that time, but I recognised something that crossed the divide between hearing and tactile sensation. I'd never heard that before. We had no stereo system at home. What we had was so lo-fi that the bass lines of songs hardly registered. It was as inadequate for blues as it was for classical music. Just to articulate the word bass seemed as if I'd said something from a book of magic spells. I'd never heard of such a thing, but there it was, looking like something wondrous from somewhere else. The sound of that bass was substantial. Notes were material objects in the room. They had shapes and colours and were only limited by their duration in time. Producing sounds on the bass demanded a level of physical participation that was unprecedented. This was the Big Bill Broonzy of instruments. Steve had been waiting to start bass lessons when his hands were larger and his fingers stronger. Mark was good enough to let us both try it out on one occasion anyway, and then, of course, I dreamt about that thing for months.